Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Reginald James, and I'm delighted to present this event to everyone today. We have the University of Arkansas partnering with us, and we have Mr. Taulbert. Dr. Bailey will be facilitating today. Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for doing that and for being with us. I'm going to turn it over real quickly because we have so much great information to get out to everyone today. Dr. Bailey.
Thank you, Reginald. I'm so delighted that Music Moves extended this invitation to me to facilitate today's discussion. We are joined by international best-selling author, Pulitzer Prize nominated writer, Mr. Clifton Taulbert. According to Taulbert, by building a powerful and effective and caring community, we can transform our environment into one that values cooperative living and welcomes diversity in all areas of life. By creating an atmosphere that supports the timeless values highlighted in his writings and conversations, individuals become part of a dynamic working community, engendering greater productivity and personal fulfillment. Taulbert's ideals of community extend the reach of the front porch people, those he encountered while growing up in the Mississippi Delta. His growing list of literary works include the award-winning Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, the Pulitzer-nominated The Last Train North, and the book the LA Times called for Americans to read, Watching Our Crops Come In. Clifton Taulbert has also written two award-winning picture books for children, one titled Little Cliff and the other Porch People and Little Cliff's First Day of School. So I just wanted to give that context because not only is Mr. Taulbert an entrepreneur, he's a writer, he's a community leader, and today's talk will be about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre. And one of the reasons that I was so delighted to be asked to help facilitate today's discussion is because as we approach the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, we've been reminded in so many ways via popular culture of this historic tragedy. So if any of you are familiar with HBO's Lovecraft Country, that was a popular depiction of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Also HBO's Watchmen recently depicted a fictional version. But to some degree, I think people are becoming more familiar with that historic atrocity, but still many people do not know the exact details. And so I'm really excited that we will be enlightened today by Mr. Taulbert. So at this point, I want to turn it over to him, and then I will intermittently check Facebook for questions. We also have some other, kind of scheduled questions so that you all can participate.
Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your introduction. I have been planning on this talk since 1973 because those were the years and time that I first learned that something significant had happened in Tulsa, but it had not become nationally known and it was not a local conversation, but today it is. Today, you can go to most parts of the world and someone will have heard of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, what caused it to be and how it came about. And for the next hour or so, we will take you on a journey as to how this particular phenomenon happened and who the people were that played an incredible role in making it happen, leaving for posterity the possibilities in spite of the tragedy that sought to bring it to naught. What are the lessons that we will learn? That we must move ahead and friendship must not get lost along the way. Because when friendship get lost along the way, too many unsavory things can happen, dreams are destroyed, and possibilities are left to die. Not unlike Lorraine Hansberry's incredible book, Raisins in the Sun, and the subsequent play that followed. What happens to a raisin when it is left to the sun? It becomes burst, it boils, it fumes, all of its goodness is just cast away. And when that happens, we see ourselves devoid of so many things that we could have learned, so many places we could have been, and so many things we could have done. And so I'm delighted that Dr. Bailey will be asking questions as we move along to sort of keep me in track, being the Southerner that I am. I can start talking and never stop. But we have a great timekeeper and a great gatekeeper, so I'm very excited about that.
All right, so I'm sorry, I have to frequently unmute myself, you all. It's multitasking during the pandemic. I'm sure you all are familiar. But I want to first ask, why is it called, or why was it called Black Wall Street?
Well, first of all, it was really dubbed Negro Wall Street early on. But in the 1960s, if you remember, something happened in the 1960s that had not happened before. And I would say that James Brown, the musician, was probably in the forefront of that. The word black had never historically represented what we thought we wanted it to represent, even though that's the color that was ascribed to us, in spite of the various variety of colors within our ethnicity and race. But James Brown came out with the song "I'm Black and Proud," and that particular song began to permeate through so many areas of our lives, even to the things that we were saying, the books that we would write, and the conversation that we would hold. And it was during that time that there was this subtle shift from those things that were called Negro began to change, and they were called Black. So the Negro Wall Street of America is how it was dubbed early on, in the time and during the time when that was the quote unquote acceptable term to define us as a people. But in the 1960s, that changed to Black Wall Street.
Excellent, thank
So
you so much.
no problem at all. So Tulsa's Black Wall Street, from my perspective, to those of you who are listening in, it's an American saga. But history is indeed a great teacher, but we must attend class. When we allow the lessons of history to become part of our thinking process, our present reality and future possibilities become undergirded with truth. When we move forward guided by truth, we leave clear paths and much needed light for the generations who follow. And this is so very, very important to understand that every one of us, we were all part of an incredible story, but we need to know that story. I need to know Reginald James' story. I need to know Constance Bailey's story. I need to know Chad's story. I need to know Miss Reagan's story. But conversely, you all need to know my story, because it is in the sharing of knowledge and information like this that we make the discovery, if you will, of our shared humanity. So history is a great teacher, but if those seats are empty and no one is at the place where history is talking, then we have truly missed an incredible class, an incredible lesson. So going to a class, attending class, is absolutely essential. So how did Black Wall Street come to be? It didn't just pop out of thin air. What happened along the way? Well, first and foremost, it's important to always know that for the Africans coming to America, even though coming in the belly of Portuguese ships as enslaved, there were about 400,000 in total. And then slavery as an export from Africa to the Americas, that was banned. But the most unfortunate part of slavery took place then, because of the 400,000 who were here. How did that 400,000 get to be around 5 million by 1865? It was due to the birth of children who were born not with the breath of freedom surrounding them, were born as an enslaved person, already predetermined to be owned by someone else. This was part of the start of the pathway to what we will eventually know as Black Wall Street. And of course, when I see this sign here, to be sold, 250 Negroes. So for 246 years, that was the life of my ancestors and many of yours that are listening in. We were the chattel property that would come to the Americas, and we would become the work machines that would be supplied to handle the fields of cotton, rice, and tobacco. The American Civil War, now that was literally about a nation divided. But at the same time, it was very important because it was at the end of the Civil War that slavery as a legal institution was demolished. And as a result of that, These people who were historically the workers, the field work, these would be my ancestors to some extent, with no future in sight other than to create children to become workers in the fields of the South. All of this became part and parcel of the journey toward Black Wall Street. Because what happened to many of those 5,000 enslaved people, we will learn as we travel this road to Black Wall Street. And of course, in 1863, that was an incredible year for the enslaved people because the Emancipation Proclamation was declared by Abraham Lincoln, but that did not free every African American. It took the 13th Amendment to complete that act, and now you have two documents, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Both of those documents combine to bring freedom to the totality of the enslaved Africans and those who were born in this country as well. But had this not happened, then we would not have had Black Wall Street. So this became one of the pathways that led to what happened in 1906 and the subsequent tragedy of 1921. The Louisiana Purchase. And I know that when we think of that and we think in terms of the $15 million that were paid for that territory, that France was in a war with Haiti at the time, and France was losing the war, and they needed money, so they sold their territory to the United States. And there were Native people living in this territory, but also at some point in time, there were enslaved people in this part of the territory as well. And what you would have in 1832, you would have the Trail of Tears. You would have the Removal Act that was employed by Andrew Jackson, and this would remove the native nations from the eastern corridors of the United States to what was then called the God-forsaken land in the territories of Oklahoma. But what many people do not know during this forced migration, there were over 5,000 enslaved people that also walked the Trail of Tears, having been enslaved by many of the civilized tribes that they were called by some, but it's 5 native nations. The Trail of Tears became part of the pathways that also led to Black Wall Street. And they would come from throughout the United States to the place they would call home, Oklahoma Territory, the birthplace of Tulsa, Black Wall Street. So all of these paths began to converge, and there was a reason for that, because the territory had land. And to become part of that land situation, bringing about some level of freedom and independence, you had people who had little, especially now that the Civil War is over, devastation had taken place, 5 million enslaved people free. Now, what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? Then you had visionaries and you had poor people in the eastern part of the United States. So all of this became a potential opportunity for people to leave their home as pioneers and migrants and find their way into the territories. And again, this amalgamation and collection of people would become the citizens that would eventually bring about what we know today as Tulsa's Black Wall Street. The voice of history, the former enslaved staking their claim. The question is this: in 1865, the 13th Amendment that freed the remainder of the enslaved people that were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. By that time, these former enslaved people began to literally draw within themselves and began to look at their possibilities for their future. For the most part, they were home. Yes, their ancestors may have come from Africa, but these people now, for the most part, were mostly Americans, having been born here, with the older generation, for the most part, having died out. After 246 years of servitude, they began to imagine more. And that, to me, is one of the incredible outcomes of Black Wall Street. What brought it about? How do you find yourself incarcerated emotionally and in many cases bound physically for 2 centuries and almost a half? And then at the end of that time period, you find yourself not only building colleges, but you find yourself building communities of your own with all of the functional factors that any other community would have. How do you jump from an enslaved creature to a person who stands upright, both physically and emotionally, to make discoveries about the world for themselves and to help, in all likelihood, to determine their own rather unique legacy? So in 1877, that is when the first Black town was built. And it was built in a place called Kansas, state of Kansas, but Nicodemus would become the name of this place. And it is still on the books today. Most of the people would have come from Kentucky, parts of Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, and how did they know about it? It's amazing to keep in mind, 1857, the first Black college in Pennsylvania had already been established. So literacy had become part of our lives, and so had newspapers. That to me is a great story, another story. The Black press was alive and well in 1877. So many of the stories of the territories made it to the ears of the listeners through the Black press, talking about a place where land was easily gotten and legal segregation was not the law of the land. Thereby, this might be the place that you could establish and call your Beulah land. So 12 years after the 13th Amendment, Nicodemus, Kansas became their town. Now, the part that I really liked was they knew in the Black community that a railroad was going to go through this particular place. So they staked their claim in the path of the railroad, which would have brought an economic boost to their community. But again, racism showed up, and as a result of that, they redirected the railroad so that it would not go through Nicodemus, Kansas. So they missed that economic opportunity that was legitimately what they had seen. This is what was going to happen. But once this town became a quote unquote an all Black town, the railroad took a different path, thereby leaving these people on their own to fend for themselves without that economic boost that had been part of the reasons that they were moving forward. Now, it's also important to understand that during this period of time, from 1877 to 1887, economic growth was very prominent within Black communities, very prominent. Men and women were building communities, their own businesses, able to really take the dollar and let it stay there for an incredible amount of time, buying from themselves, selling to themselves, making for themselves, and creating a I would say a wellspring of entrepreneurism. And one of the ones that I really just get goosebumps when I think about what happened in 1887. In 1887, only 10 years after Nicodemus, Kansas, you had Isaiah Montgomery and his cousin B.T. Green coming together with their wherewithal to purchase land in the Mississippi Delta, enough land to build a town which became the largest Black town in the United States at that time, Mount Bayou, Mississippi. And these were former enslaved people. I mean, it's amazing that during this period of time, that this idea of I can, there were no banks designed to lend them money or anything like that. They had to really coalesce around themselves. And the dream of one became the dream of all. And the newly freed slaves followed, if you will, Isaiah Montgomery and B.T. Green into this area to build this incredible place. But this is another story that eventually someone would write the story of the Montgomerys of Davis Bend, because Davis Bend is where all of these enslaved people lived on two plantations Hurricane and a fair, and excuse me for not being able to remember the name of the second plantation, but Hurricane was the main plantation and was the home of Joseph Jefferson. Joseph Davis and Jefferson Davis were brothers. Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederacy. Joseph Davis owned Hurricane, but the father of Isaiah Montgomery, Benjamin Montgomery, became the major, what I call operational stakeholder on this particular plantation. And after the Civil War, this enslaved family, now free, bought the plantations that had one time been the places of their enslavement. An incredible story of the gumption, the entrepreneurship, the idea of vision that these newly enslaved people had, free and now had for themselves. Also in Oklahoma Indian Territory, the gathering of the former enslaved from former slave states and from the Indian nations. So the all-Black towns, which was happening at the same time that things were happening in the South, in the western part of the United States, the Southwest, i.e. the territories, we had about 50 all-Black towns, and they were self-governing as any small town would be. And all of this would eventually speak and bring what I call the fire that burned within, that passion to create something bigger and better and to build something for themselves. So the 50 Black towns, which included Bowley, an incredible story. All of these towns were built in the territories. But when Oklahoma became a state in 1907, it became a southern state where legal segregation became the law of the land. And when legal segregation became the law of the land, that changed the cultural and social landscape. And Black Wall Street was right in the midst of this incredible change at the right place at the right time. Just a little to show you how some of the 50 Black towns may have looked. Redbird was the name of one, Bowley, as we talked about, Clearview was another. And I had an opportunity to do a lecture at Clearview, and it's amazing to see the remnants of the buildings that were there in the late 1800s and early 1900s that were built by our ancestors who were part of the people that had walked the Trail of Tears, descended from those people from that walk in 1832. And so that's why all of these things come together to bring about the full story of how Black Wall Street came into existence. The Dow's Allotment Act, is important to understand that, 1887, because that has to do with land. And it was the land from here, once it became allotted land to individuals, to the Indian nations, it also became allotted land to the freedmen who had once been enslaved. So during this period of time, African Americans, now free but were formerly enslaved by the native tribes, they ended up with over almost 3.5 million acres of land in the territory. And then the land run of 1889, which followed the Allotment Acts, brought people pouring into the Oklahoma Territory from throughout the United States. The overcrowded cities back east sent people as well. And then, of course, the Glenpool oil discovery of 1905. Oil had already been discovered in the Pennsylvania area, and there had been the inkling of oil in Oklahoma, but the Glenpool discovery in 1905 was the largest oil discovery in the world at that time. And Oklahoma would be called the oil capital of the world. And Tulsa was basically just a sleepy little town on the banks of the Arkansas River. But with the Glenpool discovery, it was well on its way of becoming a major city. But at the same time, it was also the place where African Americans had vision for, knew what was going on, and was positioning themselves to take advantage of this oil boom. And of course, for everything that happens in any place, anywhere, be it America, be it Europe, be it Africa, there will always be a visionary. There will always be someone that'll stop you. Let me tell you something. I think something else is happening. We need to know about it. And there were Black visionaries in the latter part of the 1800s, in the early part of the 1900s. And let's look at a couple of them. And the first is Edward P. McCabe, born free in Troy, New York. This man was positioned fairly well in Massachusetts, New York, in the places where he lived and worked. But there was something magic about the territories. So Edward McCabe left the comforts of New York, made his way to Kansas, and became involved in the governing of Nicodemus, Kansas. But he had a bright idea. He wanted the state of Oklahoma to become a Black state. And that was literally was his goal. I mean, this man was a visionary if ever there was one. He founded the city of Langston, and Langston was named for a Black legislator from back east who had agreed in Congress that he would help support financially the university that would be built there. So he had big ideas, and he never let go of those ideas. And again, there were the newspapers telling the stories of Edward P. McCabe and what he expected could happen in this new place called the state of Oklahoma. Now we have O.W. Gurley, who was a land developer. He was from Arkansas, an entrepreneur. And we're not sure if there's controversy around who bought the first 40 acres of land. So everyone is trying to find the real deed structure to figure out, but it really doesn't matter who bought the first 40 acres. What does matter is that acres were purchased and a community was built, and it became the Negro Wall Street of America, later to be known as Black Wall Street. And this is what really happened. And this man, O.W. Gurley, from Arkansas, was a real part of that. And to the extent of that part is questionable today, but everyone is still searching the archives to find out as much as they can about this man and his family and the role that they played in the creation of Black Wall Street. 1906, Greenwood was established as a community. This was really the start of Black Wall Street in the making. Now, if you notice, I have a word that I'm sure you've never used before. I call it gumptioneers. They were not entrepreneurs, and they were, but entrepreneur is a French derivative, and most people did not speak French at that time unless you were in New Orleans. Most people spoke English. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. But the word that many of the African Americans used, and Southerners as well, white Southerners, was gumption. If that boy or that girl has gumption, they can accomplish anything that they wanted. So I decided to create my own word and call it that they were Black gumptioneers. These were the people who literally set out to do something, and amazingly, they accomplished what they set out to do. Tulsa's Negro Wall Street from 1906 to 1921. That's the Oklahoma Sun. That's a Black newspaper. And this is their headline: Negro Wall Street, Greenwood District prospers. A legacy beyond enslavement. It was their paper and it was their story. It was a time that this idea of I can do this, I will do this, was a very prominent factor in all of their lives, and was absolutely an incredible opportunity to see these formerly enslaved and these children of the formerly enslaved banding together to do what had not been done before, to create fields of their own Beulah land. Now it's time to get a second question from the host.
All right, for those of you who are joining us live via Facebook or YouTube, feel free to put a question or comment in the chat. So even though we have scripted questions, because Although I am a literature scholar and a popular culture scholar, I am not necessarily a historian. So some of the questions are just because I'm nosy or because I didn't have that general knowledge. But we also want to know, like, what do you want to know, right? So feel free. I'm kind of monitoring the chat, but one of the things that I thought about, because you talked about a little bit of the history, where where the people who eventually settled in Tulsa, where they came from. I guess I'm wondering, and this might be a little bit early to ask this question, but I'm wondering, what do you think is the best or most appropriate way to honor the legacy of Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre?
You know, you have two things going on at the same time. The resiliency of a people should never be forgotten and should always be celebrated. I'm not really sure you can duplicate what once was. So how do you draw from that, if you will, in order to determine how do I become that 21st century gumptioneer? How do I become that person who can say, yes, give me the opportunity and I will do this? I think about Rome, that has a history all over the world, but the Rome of antiquity will never be repeated. It's gone. But the idea of what made Rome what it was, some of those things can move forward. And so it is with Black Wall Street. As we will be introduced to my talk, to many of the key figures that helped to build this incredible place, they have gone and they have taken with them the dreams that fueled their passion. But they have clearly left physical evidence of what can be, even when all the odds are stacked against you, what can be. So the one thing that I see very clearly that is movable, that is transferable, that is their ability to support each other. That has not changed. That ability still exists. Will we take advantage of it? That is a question that remains to be answered. But that is definitely one thing from Black Wall Street, that possibility has moved to the 21st century, and the spirit of Black Wall Street is waiting to be embraced by a new generation.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Should I move forward now?
Yes,
Okay.
please continue.
Well, let me introduce you to J.B. Stratford, who was born a slave in the state of Kentucky. Eventually became a lawyer. His JB stand for Julius Stratford, Julius B. Stratford. And the reason I'm hesitating, because it wasn't that easy to become a lawyer in the days when he did. And his father had found freedom at a point in time, who was also named J.C. Stratford, Julius Caesar Stratford. And the son was John the Baptist Stratford, thus the JB. But somehow that family had found a way to maximize their potential, that idea of how do I become something. So they had already moved along the fields of education, getting a law degree from Indiana Law School. And at the same time, he was wanting to make his mark in what was happening in Oklahoma at the time, especially in this place called Greenwood. Because by the time he heard about it, it was not called the Negro Wall Street, it was still called Deep Greenwood. And he and his family relocated there, and he began to build. And he's known most prominently today for the Stratford Hotel, that I believe it was a 49-room hotel that he built, that was absolutely incredible by the standards of the day, was the largest Black-owned hotel at that time in the country, and was well on his way of becoming a major gumptioneer, major entrepreneur for all time. But something happened along the way. But prior to that, Mr. Stratford became one of those men and his family that was truly make a difference in the territory. and make a difference in America as well. And then, of course, there were the women of Black Wall Street. To keep in mind, what we've often forgotten is that in the land allotment, there were 6-year-old girls, 14-year-old girls, 6-year-old boys, whatever the case may be. But the 160 acres went to each individual, not just to a family. So the wealth of land was very prominent for a long period of time in Oklahoma Territory. And this lady, who has been nameless, but was one of the residents of Black Wall Street, she could have easily had clothes bought in from Europe. They had the wherewithal to do it. And at the same time, as in any other place, there were those people who were not necessarily at that level. They were working as servants in the white community that was now the bustling oil town, one of the biggest oil towns in our country. So all of these things were going on around about the same time. There were some who were thriving on Greenwood, and there were others who were still finding their way. I love this picture. Think about it. Let's just say 1918. This is a 1918 picture. And you subtract 1918 from 1865. So you've gone from partially closed and enslaved to being the formation of your own chamber of commerce. It's amazing. We have something here in this place, and we're going to make it happen. Again, what we see that can be transferred to the 21st century, relationships. Relationships still matter in creating success. So that can still be transferred. And the Greenwood Booster Club is for the purpose of economic growth within their community. It's like, this is who we are, and we deserve to be known not only for who we are, but what we are doing and what we are contributing to the state of Oklahoma and to the city of Tulsa. And there they are, John and Lulu Williams, major entrepreneurs, own multiple businesses, and they were a potential for generational wealth. Now, I've carried this picture around probably since 1973 because I love this picture, because it has everything I believe in: the mom, the dad, the son, the family. This is a very successful Black family. And so I've often wondered, after the 1921 race massacre, what happened? Well, guess what? 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity of being connected to the granddaughter, the great-granddaughter, I should say, of this little boy. This little boy in the back seat of this car had 2 children, a son and a daughter. And I have met the children of the daughter by phone, by email, and by text from Indianapolis, Indiana. And so I'm wondering more as I get to know them more. I want to clearly understand what I call the independence of the female businesswoman, because the Dreamland Theater, which is this building here, the proprietor of the Dreamland Theater was Mrs. Lulu Williams. It was her name on the docket. It was her name on the placard as the proprietor owner. And when I saw that, I said, wow, independence. This lady is nailing it. She owns it, and it is there for all of us to see in the business that she and her husband had brought together. All of this was happening on a place that would eventually be called Black Wall Street. What about faith on Greenwood? The Black community has been known for generations as people of faith. And once the enslaved were freed, faith became a very real part of their lives. And wherever they were, wherever they went, wherever they landed, they built a church or worshiped in a place or building that would serve as a church. From cowshed to cathedral, wherever you had a roof, they would meet and hold church services. But this incredible place, in today's wealth, it would be probably pretty close to $1.2 million to have built the church that they built in 1920, 1921, Mount Zion Baptist Church on Greenwood. It was an incredible edifice, but it would only have a short-lived life because of the massacre of 1921. And this is a family that migrated from Water Valley, Mississippi to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the young boy standing at the back with his sister, he became part of the newspaper family, the Goodwin family, that still lives in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and still runs the newspaper that they renamed the Oklahoma Eagle. So this newspaper has been over 100 years old, is still in operations today. And this is the family from Water Valley that could have gone to Iowa, which was one of the places that many Black people had chosen to settle for the simple reason it had less legal segregation problems and the schools were open to all. But for whatever reason, on their way, they found a reason to not go any further, but to stake their claim in Oklahoma. And the family still remains here today in part. And I had the opportunity of going to college with the son of the gentleman standing in the very back. What about Dr. A.C. Jackson in Memphis, Tennessee? An incredible surgeon, an incredible medical person. Again, all of this was happening with just a generation and a half at the end of enslavement. Their abilities, their desires, and their wherewithal to accomplish great things was absolutely on their mind, in the minds of their parents and their guardians as well. And he would find himself as in practice on Greenwood, this incredible doctor, his family living in the neighborhood where most of the affluent Blacks lived at the time. But he was also a real estate investor, and the Mayo brothers of the day had dubbed him as one of the most significant Black surgeons in our country, and certainly one of the most significant African-American surgeons that they had encountered. What about Booker T. Washington? Booker T. Washington was born a slave in 1856. His mother was a slave, and his father was an unknown white person, white male. But here's a man who took what he had, reshifted his life to that of an incredible educator, an incredible communicator, but more important, and a believer of independence and self-reliance. Booker T. Washington came to Black Wall Street, and it was he who made the term the Negro Wall Street of America. An incredible man who also found part of his life on Black Wall Street. And this is the man's meat market. I love this. I mean, they're ready for business. They weren't worried about customers because the over 10,000 people that live in the place called Black Wall Street / Deep Greenwood would be their customers. They were already there. They bought from each other, and in so doing, created an abundance of wealth that circulated within their community. And being a native Mississippian, I love the idea that one of the most philanthropic of Greenwood dwellers was a Black gentleman, Simon Berry, from Grenada, Mississippi. Not only was he a philanthropist, but he was also had a business that could be easily described as the forerunner to the Uber business today. He had a jitney service where he would literally, you could call him or send a word up, I need to go somewhere, and he would have someone there to pick you up. It wasn't a cab service, it was his jitney service. And then because Black people were not riding the city bus, it didn't become a problem for him. He created a bus service that at some point in time, he actually sold it to the city of Tulsa. And secondly, he donated the land for a park in Tulsa. He was truly a philanthropist. And when he married, his wedding was written up in the major Tulsa newspaper, and he also owned the Royal Hotel. There was more than one hotel on Black Wall Street, and he was the owner of one. From Grenada, Mississippi, and he had the only private charter plane service Black owned in the country. And I find this to be fascinating because in order to do that, he had to learn how to fly. But it doesn't give me the history of where he went to flying school, but he did fly. He owned his plane and he made part of the living doing that. I mean, he was not without the ability to see an opportunity on every footstep he would make. He was doing something different and adding on to his legacy of business. Buck Colbert Franklin was born in 1879 in the Chickasaw Nation. He was the father, he would become the father of John Hope Franklin, the noted Black historian who wrote this incredible book, Up from Slavery to Freedom, an incredible book. And what I've tried to do most of my life is to find those publications that not only tell our story, but leave us with a clear understanding of who we really are and what we were accomplishing, even though barriers were in the way. And what we did was not just for us, but we were doing things that would have a positive benefit for America at large. Buck Colbert Franklin, as we will learn, during 1921, was in Tulsa on the night of the massacre and day, because he and his wife were living in a place called Rennieville with their young son. And Rennieville was another all-Black town as well in Oklahoma. But he had decided that everything that was happening, that Tulsa was the place to be. And so you had people who had done well in these small towns now bringing with them their intellectual capacity, their political acumen, all of the things that were needed began to flood into this place called Deep Greenwood, dubbed the Negro Wall Street of America, and subsequently Black Wall Street. And this is where he wanted to open up his law practice and was scheduled to do so within the week before the riot and this massacre of 1921. Dreams born and destroyed. Oprah Dargan is the first survivor that I had the opportunity to speak with. I remember distinctively because we were at a meeting at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa where she served as an advisory board member, as did I. But she was a civic leader by any stretch of the imagination, an educator for decades, a love with her city, and always trying to do something to better the lives of the young African Americans. And as a member of the advisory committee, one day we just were sitting down talking, and that was in the 70s. And all of a sudden she said, "Do you know about who we are?" And I said, well, what are you talking about, Miss Dargan? She said, do you know who we are? And she began to tell me this incredible story of her parents, the friends of her parents, the church that they attended, the businesses that surrounded their lives. She said, we're the people of Black Wall Street. I said, wow. She said, but I remember the night it all went away. And said, it did my mama awfully bad, awfully bad. Fire was everywhere. We were running as far as we could, as hard as we could. Everybody was saying, get out of your house, get out of your house. It's burning down. Everything is burning down. That's when I first heard the story. That's when I first felt the pain of the story. That's when I first felt the heat from the flames of the story. When a young girl, barely 7 years old, could remember distinctively the world that was destroyed that would have been her home. The night of the 1921 fire and the massacre that took place on June 1st. In 48 hours, the world that had started being built from the day they first landed on these American shores in 1619 was suddenly taken away from them as if it had never been. The flames would destroy the Dreamland Theater. That would have been the legacy of their young son, John. But let's keep on. Let's continue. What happened? May 30th was Memorial Day, and the Black soldiers had come home, the white soldiers had come home. And that was part of the challenge. Because in America, when they brought the Blacks into World War I, they had to really try to figure out the social implications of that. When I say they, I'm referring to the economic, the political power structure of the day. And of all the allies that America had, France would become the country that say, we will gladly fight alongside your Black soldiers. And for the Black soldiers to have gone to France to fight alongside the Frenchmen, well, for many of them would have been the first times in their lives that they would have been treated as full-fledged, breathing human beings. They had had a sense of freedom and independence that they had never known in their own home country. Now, all of these young men were coming back. And that brought fear to a lot of people because they said they will not live the way they had lived before. So May 30th, the churches in Tulsa, both white and Black churches, would celebrate Memorial Day. But on May 31st, an incident happened in the Drexel building. Sarah Page, a young white girl who ran the elevators, it was said that she was accosted by Dick Rowland, a young Black guy, owns a shoe shine parlor on Greenwood, and he worked at the hotels as well. And this became the catalyst that brought about the potential hanging of this guy, because the mob wanted him, even though the information was false. It had already become somebody else's truth. And when falsehoods becomes your truth, and you begin to act on the falsehoods as if they were true, that brings about an emboldened level of destruction. And this is what happened on Greenwood, May 31st, the day of. And then, of course, that night, getting him out of jail And that night is when the fire started. And on June 1st is when the vigilantes, thousands of Southern, I can't say Southern because they were from all across the country, had come to work in the oil fields. That all of whom were white, gathered together, thousands, and they looted, they burned, and they killed. But it was also the first time in a big way that the Black men did not just lay down and say, kill me. They had brought back with them the same type of self-reliance and independence that they had witnessed in Paris, France. And they had their guns as well. So it was a fight, but how do you win a fight when the whole system is fighting against you? But they did the best they could, and they lost all they had. Beulah land was destroyed. That's Black Wall Street, 37 square blocks. The Stratford Hotel, the Dreamland Theater, Mount Zion Baptist Church, the home of A.C. Jackson, who was actually killed on his way to the city gymnasium where many of the Blacks were held captive. But it was the fire, and whatever the fire didn't get, the looters took it away. Now, a question from the host.
Thank you. So that image was sobering. I think many of us need to digest it. But before I ask my next question, one thing I wanted to remark, to just comment on or bring to the audience's attention is when you talked about interviewing the survivor, right? This young woman who is, young lady who's 7, 8 years old, little girl, really. The importance of oral tradition and living history and preserving those memories, right? And so not all the time, hopefully at least, they won't always be memories of trauma, but I would encourage you, if you have not talked to your parents and grandparents, and any elders who are still living, to ask them questions, because you would be amazed. Many of us, our parents or grandparents, are just one generation removed from slavery, in some cases, depending on our age. So that was a comment I wanted to just make. The other thing, you spoke a little bit to the reason for Black Wall Street, or for the race massacre, but I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about, we know from Ida B. Wells, and even contemporary folks like Brian Stevenson, who's working on the National Lynching Memorial. We know that oftentimes lynching, that the accusation at least was this affront to white femininity, or somehow like sexual overtures, but that oftentimes that was in some cases an outright lie, or a way to justify, right, take lynching so that you could take Black people's property, and all of these things. And so I guess my question for you is, what do you think really was the underlying cause? Do you think it was racial animus? Was it this perceived economic threat from all of these Black businesses? What in your opinion was the kind of main reason, other than supposedly this guy, said something to, this woman?
Well, that's a good question, Dr. Bailey. And what I find to be interesting, the white sheriff at the time, went out of his way to protect this guy. So somehow, somewhere, they knew that these accusations weren't true at all. They knew that. But those accusations became a match in the hands of so many others, because there was something else going on economically as well. At that time, the railroads were major transportation modes. And it has been said that where Black Wall Street was located would be an excellent location to expand the railroad system in our city. But they would never sell the land. So it's interesting that after the race massacre, with everything gone, very significant people were trying to buy their land for pennies on the dollar. But they would not sell their land. And one of the people that worked with them and literally went to court on behalf of them was Buck Colbert Franklin, an incredible lawyer, to help them understand this is your land. Eminent domain was trying to find its way into that, but it didn't work. So I would say when greed is present, for whatever the reason it might be, it brings with it a whole different set of reasons and circumstances, if you will, for people to deal with. It brings another whole set, and you're never quite sure what's driving people to accomplish what has particularly happened. But I can say greed would certainly have been a part of it. Jealousy could easily have been a part of it because Greenwood was doing well and the war was over. And when the war was over, the demand for oil was not as strong as it was during the war and prior to. So you had a lot of unemployment at the same time. So all of these things began to come together to create too many people at a small place and maybe too many Black people taking up space.
Wow, thank you. Great answer. All right, please continue.
I just want you to take some time. This was not a posed photograph. This was a real photograph of a brother holding a brother. And I thought about the Holly song. He's not heavy. He's my brother. And that picture also symbolizes what was I call the spirit of Black Wall Street. You are my sister. You are my brother. You are my aunt. You are my uncle. You can depend on me, and I can depend upon you. You can tell the way the little boy is hanging there. He's gone. But he's being handled with care. He's being handled with a sense of value. And when you value something, it's not difficult to let the sense of brotherhood and sisterhood guide your actions. So on June 1st, after the night of May 31st, buildings are gone. And according to the Salvation Army, there's another book that I read, if I have it here. Yeah, here it is. This book right here is called Sweeping Through the Land. The Salvation Army, I'll read to you what it says. The resurgence of the Klan was more than a nuisance. It was deadly. The city of Tulsa, which had heretofore enjoyed some degree of racial tranquility, became the scene of a pitched battle between Blacks and whites, where a race riot erupted on June 1st, 1921. Before it was ended, over 800 Blacks and whites were dead, and the entire Black area of the city was burned to the ground. Now, this story is not about the race riot, but it is about the Salvation Army who was operating in Tulsa at the time. So the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross, they were two of the agencies that were let in to work with the Black survivors during and after the riot. And the Salvation Army, this lady had the responsibility of feeding the Black prisoners who were all in leg chains to dig the graves to bury the dead. So if you're digging the grave to bury the dead, then somehow everyone does not know who's dead. The dead are just being buried. That's a real picture of the vigilantes picking up Blacks along the way, and all with their guns. Overnight, citizens became vagrants. Citizens became homeless. Citizens were marched to the convention hall where many of them were held as prisoners. Their world was gone. And in order to live within the context of their world, they were given green cards. And you could not leave the area that had been defined to you unless you had a green card signed by someone else. It was not only their world was destroyed, but the insult on their humanity grew even more. And there it is, you can see the billowing smoke coming out of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. And the Dreamland Theater is now rubbish. All that the Williams had built has been destroyed. Black Wall Street totally destroyed. Hundreds of businesses burned to the ground and thousands of Black citizens homeless. The role of Tulsa's nonprofit organization made a difference in their lives some 24 hours later. The Red Cross did a yeoman's job. Maurice Willows, who was the director of the cross, came from St. Louis, but his cultural background was Canadian. So his relationship with Blacks was much different than the whites of the city. Not only did he respect the Black leaders, but worked closely with them to erect the makeshift homes that would be built to get them through the winter when everything was gone primarily. The YMCA, and then the YWCA, and then the colored branches of both organizations, as it was called at that time, had people coming in from across the country volunteering to work with the survivors. The newspapers, Black newspapers, sent reporters in from across the country because Black Wall Street had become a place of lore and inquisitiveness, because it was in a place that most people had never gone before, the territories, now a state, now with this incredible economic phenomenon brought on by African Americans. This became the conversation of East Coast Blacks. They wanted to see this place. Now that it's gone, the story of its demise became fodder for the newspapers. They were telling the story. Black newspapers were sent. They sent their reporters to Tulsa to interview, to take pictures, and to let the world know what had really happened. And the story of Black Wall Street demise would end up in Europe. And before I talked, or right after I talked to Mrs. Dargan, Oprah Dargan, my office was on what we call the UCAT campus, the University Center at Tulsa. And a group of journalists, photojournalists, came in from Europe. And I believe they had come from Germany at the time. and they came to interview survivors. And I was asked to be one of the people that they would interview with what little I knew, which was not that much at all at the time. But I remember distinctively, they called it America's Dirty Little Secret. And they had come to find out about what happened in 1921. Because almost for 75 years, almost, it had been swept so far under the rug that there were people born in Tulsa, lived all of their lives in Tulsa. They never heard about it, didn't know that it existed. And for those who did, it wasn't a conversation that was talked at during the Christmas or celebrating holidays. I think the pain was too great for those who were that close by. And I would often bring survivors to my home and talk with them and take notes as they talked. And even though these survivors may have been a generation removed from the actual event itself, their pain was still easily seen. They carried, their faces carried the hurt and pain of their parents and their grandparents. So just to talk to them was basically to take you there. But it would rise from the ashes. And one of the people clearly involved, you can clearly see the picture just superimposed in the middle where the white shirts are. One of them is of B.C. Franklin. The darker man is B.C. Franklin. Has set up his law office, now burned down and not there, in a tent on Greenwood, and went to work immediately. That is what amazed me. After everything was gone, within weeks, not months, not years, within weeks, they had started to build again. But what they built the second time around did not have the nuances of what they had built the first time. Because the first time, their heart, their soul, their creativity, their innovative mind, everything was in play, even to the minute details, because this would be their commemorative gift to their children and to their grandchildren and to their great-grandchildren. It would always be there, and they wanted it to be a grand remembrance. By 1926, they had begun to live again, and visitors would find themselves coming to Oklahoma to see the halcyonic rise of this community from the ashes, bringing George Washington Carver and W.E.B. Du Bois, coming to see this city who has risen from the ashes of destruction. Yes, thriving again on deep Greenwood, Black Wall Street. The smiles was coming back and people were smiling again. The Black Press from 1827, which was our first newspaper, the Freedom's Journal, to the newspapers of the 1900s. They promoted Black settlement. They shared business, social, and church news, Black business ads. And in the early days of the early 20s, they not only told the story of Black Wall Street, but they told the story of 1919 as well, which was called the Red Summer, because so much blood was shed when scores of other Black towns and communities, some of them were virtually totally destroyed, partially destroyed, and many of them had death to remember. Hangings took place during the Red Summer. That economic window of opportunity that African Americans had grabbed with all the gusto that one could to establish themselves finally rooted in the place that they now call home, was being undermined and destroyed. But even so, they never quit. I will never understand it. I applaud it. I'm delighted to be descendants of them, as we all are who are African Americans. Their stalwart ability to not give up is absolutely amazing. Briefly, the history unknown to most. When I was a student at the University of Maryland, I was doing a study of the Kingdom of Kush, and I couldn't find any documentation that I needed. And I finally ran across a letter by Dr. George Reisner, who was an Egyptologist, a Harvard graduate, who simply said that no one of Negroid heritage or gene pool could have built anything as magnificent as the kingdoms of Kush. Surely these people robbed the tombs of Egypt and claimed their findings as their own. Well, last year in September, the Smithsonian did an incredible story, The Lost Kingdom of Kush, and went in detail about members of the 25th dynasty of the Black African pharaohs that ruled all of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is the history unknown to most, certainly was unknown to me, but it's our history nonetheless. I sometimes think that maybe the enslaved Africans who had become Americans, they had a cultural DNA that traveled back to worlds that maybe only the Africans would have known about, when they were rulers of their own destiny, a time and place in history. And then National Geographic in 2008 came out with a publication called The Black Pharaohs and told their stories as well. Hezekiah of Judah and the Black Pharaoh. I simply say read 2 Kings, the 19th chapter, starting at the 9th verse. And you read the story of the Black Pharaoh, who was one of the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty of African kings who ruled Upper and Lower Egypt, and will relieve the relationship that Hezekiah had with the pharaoh Tahakakra, Taharqa. It's spelled many different places, different ways, but it's the same king. Never knew that existed. And then, of course, the 14th century, when Charles III was ruling England, there was another person that was absolutely phenomenal, Massacre, who ruled the Malayan Empire and has been defined as the wealthiest individual that ever lived. So in the 14th century, Africa produced Emperor Mansa Musa of the Malayan Empire, the wealthiest historical figure, wealth valued at $400 to $415 billion today. And he's compared with the major financiers of our world, like the Bezos, the Gates. All their wealth combined does not come to the wealth of this one Black emperor, Mansa Musa. So what is happening? The intersection of the past and the future. The spirit of Black Wall Street is a catalyst. It can challenge a new generation. It can recapture the spirit of unbridled enterprise that once defined Black Wall Street. So all those things that can recreate that emotional place, that spiritual place, that place of personal integrity and personal commitment. It happens through the decisions that one makes, as they made decisions in 1920, 1921. The intersection of the past and the future, Black Wall Street. This is an artist's rendition of what is currently being built, scheduled to be done before the celebration takes place. Become the first museum primarily dedicated to the life and legacy of 1921, when deep Greenwood was called the Black Wall Street of America. Now the fourth question from the host.
Wow. I actually think I want to table my question because I did see a question on the Facebook Live. So if that's okay, I
Okay,
will.
sure.
Yeah. And also to your comment, enlightening us about how rich Mansa Musa was. I heard his name dropped on at least two Jay-Z songs. So if nothing else is a testament to his wealth, then the fact that Jay-Z has referenced him speaks to how wealthy he was. So the question is, were the community members of Black Wall Street predominantly buying and selling from each other after the massacre, or who were they purchasing, from, and who were they selling to?
That's a good question, a very, very good question. Keep in mind that 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, they also brought to the territory, now a state, the Jim Crow laws and legal segregation. So for the most part, the stores that were in the greater Tulsa area were not open to Blacks. So in all likelihood, there were over 10,000 or so Black residents of Deep Greenwood, so from 10 to 12,000. And then there were still Blacks living, I would say, in a 20-mile radius, a 30-mile radius, a 15-mile radius in small towns that had been Black communities early on. They were also coming into Black Wall Street area, purchasing as well. It was their place. So in all likelihood, there may have been a few white purchasers, but I would say 95 to 98% of the commerce that took place on Black Wall Street were Blacks among Blacks.
Excellent, thank you. And then my fourth question was really about with so much economic insecurity, racial strife, racial tensions being pervasive throughout society. I'm wondering if you think that it's possible for a Tulsa race massacre to occur again. Do you see like a city like Memphis, let's say, that has an affluent Black population, or that has a concentrated area of Black businesses, maybe is the better way to put that. Do you see the possibility for that to occur?
That's a question I wish I didn't even have to ponder, but I have to ponder it. And I think that January the 6th may have influenced how I answer that today. If January the 6th had not happened, I probably would have said that what happened in 1867 and the days following the freedom of all the enslaved people and trying to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau and those Union compatriots that occupied the South during that time to ensure that the newly freed Black would have access to government and life. I would probably have said that we have a long ways to go, but we're on the right road. January the 6th showed me something I never thought I would see. Not in our country. If that many people can gather to somehow wreak havoc upon our nation's capital? Where do we fit as a people on the scale of their importance? Certainly not that high. I would say it has a better chance of happening now than it did before January the 6th.
Wow. Well, I'm just going to let the significance of those words kind of, settle in with our audience, and we'll see if we have any more questions in the chat, if you can linger with us for
Sure, no
a while.
problem.
And I would say, just for those of you who are geographically challenged like myself, the Tulsa Race Massacre is significant, not just in terms of national and international history, but for those of us who are in Northwest Arkansas, or if you are watching from abroad, uh, Fayetteville, Arkansas, where the U of A is located, is less than 2 hours drive away from Tulsa, and so that history, and even some, one or two of the, early inhabitants of Greenwood Street, was a wealthy Black man from Arkansas, if I remember correctly. So it's very much relevant to, not just, as far as the historical memory for Northwest Arkansas, but the implications for us here in this area today. So I'm so glad that you brought that out.
Well, it has really been my pleasure just to open the door and to tell other American stories. Because until I know your story and you know mine, there could potentially be a gulf between us, and there's no need for that. We have too short of a shelf life on the planet not to make it the best life that we can.
Well, amen to that. I have so much enjoyed the conversation with fellow Mississippian, Mr. Clifton Taulbert, and I learned what a gumptioneer was. So
Thank
that
you.
was a learning experience, and I hope that those of you watching learned something as well. I'm going to give the chat one last scan just to make sure we don't have any questions that I missed. And otherwise, I would just, thank you thank everyone who chimed in today for joining me and Music Moves. I know that they have a full tableau of events in store for you all for Black History Month, so be sure that you subscribe to Music Moves AR, their Facebook page and their YouTube channel. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Taulbert.
And thank you. You could be the host on all of my programs. I got to figure out how to make that happen.
Yes, let's do it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Right. And I will stay on in case our hosts need to talk to me before I won't get off. I'll just kind of ease out.
Sounds good.
I will ease out, but I want to talk to you offline.
Okay. I hate that we didn't get a chance to get this question in because I was trying to type it, but I heard you mention Memphis. Are there any other meccas that of Black enterprise? We know about Atlanta, but are there any other hot spots that you know about right now that are up and coming?
You know, not really that I'm aware of. Maybe I think I know Charlotte, North Carolina has a rather large population of African Americans. And because of the university structures that are there, I would think would be a possibility for Charlotte, North Carolina to somehow. And I've often wondered about Durham because Durham has such a history akin to Black Wall Street early on. And some of our most stable Black businesses were instituted in Durham, North Carolina. I mean, major businesses were there as well.
Okay, look, I know you have so much information. Mr. Taulbert, and I want you one day to jump in. I'm sure Dr. Bailey will want to jump in too on this, on Wilmington,
Yeah.
about what happened there, because there's a whole nother story, and I just learned about it just in the last 2 years. So we'll let you unpackage that one day. We look forward to you coming back.
Well, you know, the one thing that I have to keep in mind, I was doing some writing this morning about the Red Scare. And I'm thinking, and I got to the point that so many cities were listed where hanging and murder had taken place against Black people. I started to cry. I mean, I knew it was a big something, but I did not realize it was that many cities that all of this happened in 1919. And it seemed as if the military, the soldiers getting out, the white soldiers, seemed in many of the cities had part in what had taken place. But there was also the element of not enough jobs, unemployment, and it seems as if the Black person had become a stand-up person, no longer laying down to be walked over. So you didn't have just people rushing in, you had people pushing back as well. And I just had no idea that it was, I mean, even New York City had its problems in 1919.
Wow.
I mean, they call it the red summer is what they call it. And rightly so, for the blood that was shed.
You already know how we feel about you, Mr. Taulbert. Thank you so much for joining us today and for making this what it was. It's been shared so many times already on Facebook. So we look forward to hearing from you again, and we hope that you'll keep us in mind. Don't forget about us.
Oh, I won't.
Jump on your new ventures. Look, don't forget about us here, as Dr. Bailey mentioned, the Mississippi folks on this side. Don't forget about us.
Well, I can't forget you, Reginald, because you know of my family back in Mississippi, back in Lorman County, that you know probably more about them than I do. I've only seen them once in my life. And I was a little boy then.
Well, we look forward to the day that we can do two things. Remember, we say we going to a ball game, and hopefully we can get to Mississippi together.
I'll remember that. Okay. You guys take care now.
You too. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Bailey.
Thank you for having me.
I know you headed to the next event, girl. So.
I'm gonna finish writing the talk for the next event.
Okay.